We're back with part 2 of lecture 2 on westward expansion, and we left off with a discussion of how incredibly diverse the Old West was during the late 19th century. More specifically, we've talked about all these recent arrivals to the Old West. We need to talk about those for whom this is their ancestral homeland, that meaning the Native Americans or the indigenous peoples. We've already seen throughout the United States history up until this point that the government has not hesitated to forcibly relocate Native Americans so that white Americans could settle land. In the eastern half of the United States, you might be familiar with the Trail of Tears initiated by the Jackson administration to enforce the terms of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Post-Civil War, we're seeing many more Americans coming into now the Midwest and the far West and taking over territory that was the ancestral homeland of many native tribes. In retaliation, many communities such as the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Comanche began defending their homeland from these illegal intrusions. But Americans fought back, demanding that the government protect them from these supposedly hostile and savage peoples. In American culture, already we've seen the development of the negative stereotype of Native peoples as inherently uncivilized or supposedly given to violent rages. And so for many Americans during this period, they're being bombarded with all of these negative stereotypes, and having never actually met a Native American for themselves, they preferred to believe that these people were savages, and therefore that killing savages was not a bad thing to take over their land. In the words of one Colorado militia member during the late 19th century, he considered Native Americans, quote, an obstacle to civilization, who should be exterminated. We will see that the U.S. government will largely second this idea, and we will see a series of so-called Indian wars breaking out throughout the West and Midwest during the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. There will be a number of tribal leaders, however, such as Geronimo of the Apache, who will resist the incursion onto their lands, who will resist the U.S. government demanding that they resettle somewhere else and open up this land for settlement for American citizens. Geronimo's first confrontation was with the Mexican government. The area in which the Apache inhabited were areas that at one time were under Mexican control. After the Mexican-American War, and this territory in present-day Arizona, southern Arizona, for example, in New Mexico, now came under American control. Now it will be the U.S. Army that will be harassing the Apache, trying to take that land from them and forcibly resettle them onto land reserved just for Native American use. So here's where we are introduced to the idea of a reservation. The United States government will do this not just to the Apache, but to countless other tribes. They will ultimately wage wars against them and force the remaining survivors, of which there are not very many, to resettle on land that will be specifically reserved for use only by Native peoples. On these reservation lands, the U.S. government will go several steps further in a bid to try to assimilate Native Americans into American society. They will open up English language schools. They will force Native children to begin learning English as their primary language. They will open up churches to try and Christianize many of these Native peoples. In other words, there will be a systematic attempt on the part of the U.S. government throughout the late 19th and early 20th century to deprive Native peoples of their ancestral heritage. And even after much Native land will be confiscated by squatters or settlers, American settlers with the permission of the U.S. government, even that land won't be enough over time. In 1887, we will see the U.S. Congress pass the Dawes Act. This act was aimed at freeing up even more Native American land for the government to sell off to settlers in the region. Many of these large reservation lands will now be broken up into individual tracts of land so that the U.S. government could then sell the territory in between settlements. This will result in Native American tribes losing an additional 100 million acres of land to the U.S. government through this act. This will also be a bid on the part of the U.S. government to try and stop many of these tribes from coordinating military actions in defense of their homeland. The idea is if you can now break up these settlements, that the people will slowly lose their language, they will slowly lose their culture and become more American-like, and ultimately this will settle them down and force them to stop fighting against the U.S. government. So what about the experience of those traveling westward during this period? What was life like for these so-called pioneers along the frontier during the period? Well, the trip to begin with was very long and uncomfortable. As we mentioned earlier in the lecture, for those who could not afford railroad transportation of themselves and their families, they had to do it the old school method, which was covered wagon trains. You never traveled alone. You always traveled with larger groups of settlers. More eyes are better to scan the horizon for threats from robbers or Native Americans that were, fighting to stop these trespassings on their land. But it was dusty. You can see the photograph that I have here on the slide. Imagine inhaling the dust kicked up by the hooves of the horses or oxen pulling the 3 or 4 wagons in front of you. You're breathing this in and day out. There's no air conditioning in these wagons. There's no heating. So yeah, you're out in the elements every day, and risking your life essentially. The further west you go, the more the annual rainfall amounts drop off as well. So you're constantly searching for sources of fresh water in an increasingly arid landscape as you get to the Midwest. You're looking for new sources of food. There aren't any, Taco Bell drive-thrus. There's not a Walmart that you can go pick up tortilla chips from. You're having to constantly see to your most basic needs, water number one, and secondarily food, on an almost daily basis. Sickness also dogged many of these expeditions. Cholera and dysentery were common among migrants, running rampant through family groups traveling together for so many months in such close quarters. Exposure to the elements could also lead to death. Overheating under the hot summer sun, hypothermia during the winter time, attacks by wild animals. All of these things led to a high number of deaths during the period among those attempting to start a new life elsewhere. It was a common sight during the period along some of the most well-traveled trails, the Santa Fe Trail, the Overland Trail, the Oregon Trail, to see hundreds of grave markers lining, each of these trails. It would have been a very eerie sight. And the hardships didn't stop at the end of the trail. They carried over into life in these new migrants' home sites. To begin, when families did decide to stop and put down roots, they did not have a nice little log cabin waiting for them to occupy. In fact, in the Midwest, these treeless plains don't provide any ready-made building material for you to construct to get out of the harsh winter winds. So settlers in the Midwest in particular dug up the sod beneath their feet. These so-called sod houses were a common sight in the Midwest during this period. Having a home made out of dirt was better than freezing to death in the winter time, that's for sure. But can you imagine how icky it would be to have spiders crawling out of your roof or snakes? When it rained, these are not watertight structures, so you'd end up with mud dripping, on the floor. These were not nice habitable structures, but they could get these families through the first or maybe second harsh winters, and hopefully then a railroad line would be constructed nearby so that timber cut from eastern forests could be shipped in via the railroad, and then you could start to build a more normal and airtight, watertight structure to live in. In the meantime, you also have to find a source of water, so you have to spend the energy digging a well. You have to have a place to house your livestock. So here's where community becomes incredibly important. An individual family likely could not homestead all by themselves successfully. You would invite community members to come in for a barn raising. You would provide free liquor. There has to be some inducement, after all, for people to work for you. But free liquor, and everyone would work very hard for one day, and then they'd sit around the fire and they'd tell stories and they'd relax for a little bit, and your barn would get built in a fraction of the amount of time that it would take you and your family to do it all by yourselves. Then you would repay the favor. Several weeks on down the line, you would go to help one of your neighbors build a barn, or build a fence, or build a bridge. Is it any wonder, therefore, that many new arrivals to the West ultimately decided to abandon their new home shortly after arrival? For example, nearly 1/2 of settlers who staked a homestead claim in Kansas between 1862 and 1890 eventually gave up their rights to the land. In other words, almost 50% of the people that were given this land could not meet the requirement of staying on that land for a minimum of 5 years so that they could receive the title free and clear. In some areas, however, especially in the upper Midwest, where you have large immigrant family groups coming in, think the Finns, the Germans, the Swedes, they managed to pull together and establish permanent communities. And ultimately, we will see through new mechanization of agricultural instruments, horse-drawn reapers, mechanical reapers, and harvesters, that some of the grinding labor that had been done by hand, this new machinery can now help to alleviate some of that toil. We will also see through what we call today the genetic modification of crops, that new strains of wheat and corn that could grow with less water were eventually cultivated, so that in the more arid regions of the Midwest and the Far West, we can see farming families managing to make a go of it ultimately. And in fact, over time, the Midwest will become known as the nation's breadbasket. That's where a large amount of rye and wheat and corn will ultimately be grown to feed other areas of the country.